welcome to this conversation about the battle in defense of free speech. Please welcome our guest Toby Young. I don't even know how best to introduce you. I've had a short look at your resume, and my impression is that there's nothing you haven't done in the British media. I had a suspicion you hadn't worked for The Guardian, but you have refuted that. You have also worked for The Guardian, The Spectator, The Times, The Telegraph, everything. You even founded, as a young man, you founded a journal, is that correct?
Yes. Yeah, I did. I founded...
you were young and naive.
Yeah. It was called The Modern Review. And it was a journal published every 2 months. And it was academics and intellectuals writing about popular culture. So Arnold Schwarzenegger, Madonna, and we did it in the same format as the New York Review of Books to try and we thought it was a good joke to kind of have people write about schlock, but in a very intellectual way, in a kind of intellectual format. And the strapline was low culture for highbrows. And at the time, it was quite revolutionary. This was in 1991, but within a few years, our way of analysing popular culture was then taken up by the mainstream press. So it kind of quickly lost its unique selling point, and so it only lasted 5 years.
So in the good old times when we grew up as journalists and worked back in the 90s, 80s, 90s, really everything was possible, wasn't it? These were creative times, many ideas, many bright sparks, fascinating time to be alive and working. Now we are in the 2020s and things have changed, haven't they?
Yeah, I think in some ways it's become easier to start your own magazine. So at its height, the Modern Review had a circulation of maybe 15,000, a few in America, but mainly in the UK. And that was at its absolute peak. For most of the time, it sold fewer than 10,000 copies. And it was quite hard to make it work because we had to pay the print costs and we had to pay our staff to come into an office and rent the office and so forth. Though actually I did it in my flat. But I recently started an online sort of news publishing site in April of 2020 called Lockdown Skeptics. And it was a kind of hub where people who wanted to challenge the wisdom of the lockdown policy could kind of express their reservations in a sort of safe space for skeptics. And when Boris lifted all the COVID restrictions on what he called Freedom Day...
Not me, I presume. I'm also Boris.
No, not you. When
okay.
Boris Johnson lifted all the restrictions in, I think, July 19th of last year, we then pivoted and became skeptical about a variety of public policies supposedly informed by the science, principally net zero, as well as COVID restrictions and the mRNA vaccines and so forth. And it's now become the Daily Skeptic. But last month, for instance, we got 2 million page views, and the costs associated with a digital publication are obviously much lower. So it's much easier to keep that going, make it sustainable.
But back in the time, money was what you had to watch, what you had to worry about. When writing about these kind of things, there may be other things you need to worry about, like what you can say.
That's right, yes. So there are other, perhaps more sinister obstacles to just not having enough money. Facebook quite regularly temporarily bans the Daily Skeptic's Facebook account, as well as my Facebook account, and makes it difficult to promote the content on Facebook. We've had a little bit of trouble, not quite so much trouble with Twitter, but certainly if you are challenging the prevailing orthodoxies across certain areas. So, I mean, there are certain kind of areas in which if you challenge the prevailing orthodoxy, you're likely to be accused of misinformation or hate speech, and that is the pretext for trying to suppress what it is you're trying to say. So, and I think those areas are, broadly speaking, it used to be if you challenged the wisdom of the lockdown policy, you were quite likely to have your content removed from Facebook or YouTube in particular.
That's one thing, and many people complain about it, but I understand bank accounts can also be
yes, so I think
closed.
So big tech censorship of dissenting points of view is one obstacle we have to contend with. But another more recent obstacle is that PayPal, the payment processing giant based in California, recently closed the account of the Daily Skeptic, my account, and the account of the Free Speech Union, which we might get onto, which is an organization I set up in 2020 to defend free speech. And without giving any kind of proper explanation, it just said that it had decided that all three accounts were in breach of its acceptable use policy, and that it was closing them immediately. And that was, in my own case, that wasn't too problematic. I mean, I had about £600 in the account, and they froze the funds and said that they would keep some of them. But in the case of the Daily Skeptic, it was more serious. About a quarter of our recurring donations were being made via PayPal, but it was very serious in the case of the Free Speech Union because about a third of our members were paying their recurring membership dues.
Wait. Free Speech Union. We haven't even mentioned that.
No.
What is it?
So that's an organization I set up in February 2020 to defend free speech, primarily in the UK, though it now has sister organizations in New Zealand and South Africa and the US. And it's a membership organization, and it's almost like it's a combination of various things. So if you think there's a possibility you may be cancelled or investigated by your university or your employer for saying something perfectly lawful but which breaches a speech code of some kind, we will come to your defense. So we have 2 full-time lawyers on staff, we have 2 full-time case officers, we have a legal advisory council which has about 50 people on it. So about half of what we do is casework coming to the rescue of our members. We have about 10,500 members now, but we also help people who aren't members sometimes if it's an important case.
How do you finance that? You must have loads of lawyers to do the work.
Yeah, well, we finance it through a combination of membership dues. So for student members, it costs £24.95 a year. For full members, it's £49.95. And then we managed to raise about half the money we need through membership dues, and then the other half through donations. We have fundraising, dinners, events, that kind of thing. We've just begun to sell merchandise, so that's another possible source of revenue.
Let me just let that sink in. So it costs real money to be a member.
Yes, it
not
does.
$1, not $5. What did you say? 20?
It's 29.
So
it's 24.95 for student members, pensioners, veterans. 49.95 for full members.
50 for me. For me, even.
For you,
that is real money. That is real money.
Yep.
You know, I can buy things for £50.
Yes.
And you say you have 10,000 members who are ready to spend £50. What, a year, I suppose?
Yeah. Yep.
To have some kind of protection in case they say something that may get them into trouble, say something online, I suppose, that may get them into trouble. What does that say about society? Well,
I suppose it tells us that free speech is under attack, and things that you could say as recently as 10 years ago, you now get into trouble for saying, even if they're perfectly lawful. I think the Overton window of things you can say without getting into trouble, without being considered outrageous or beyond the pale, is getting narrower and narrower, and it's also shifting further and further leftwards. So for instance, 10 years ago, if you said, I don't think women have penises, you are unlikely to get cancelled. If you say that now, if you're, for instance, a lecturer at a university, you can get into serious trouble for saying you don't think women have penises. And increasingly, there are just more and more things you can get into trouble for saying.
Not in Hungary, I don't think.
Not in Hungary. Maybe there are other things you can get into trouble for saying in Hungary.
So, Can you think off the top of your head of a case where your organization was able to help and that springs to your mind?
Yes, so we had a recent success with a train conductor who worked for West Midlands Trains. He's called Simon Isherwood, and during, I think, the third lockdown, he was asked by his employer to undergo unconscious bias training. And in the course, and it was an online unconscious bias training course via Zoom, and he was introduced, I think, for the first time to the concept of white privilege. And he was a working class man who'd worked hard all his life for the railways, and didn't think of himself as particularly privileged in virtue of being white. So he was not particularly persuaded by that idea.
This is like a re-education camp, except your employer sets it up for you?
It's ubiquitous now in the UK, across the public sector and the private sector.
Why would employers do that?
Because they think it's promoting the equity, diversity, and inclusion agenda. That the only reason there aren't more women and people of colour in senior management positions is because of unconscious bias. So
does it make any economic sense for them?
Well, they claim it makes economic sense. So companies like McKinsey tell them that if they have a proper equity, diversity, and inclusion policy, it helps the bottom line. But I mean, that's contentious.
But right, so this guy, your worker,
so this guy Simon Isherwood,
himself in that program.
He was being taught about white privilege via Zoom, and at the conclusion of the training program, he thought he'd disconnected from Zoom, but he'd left it running. And he turned to his wife and said, "White privilege? What a load of balls. Do you think they have black privilege in African countries where a majority of the population are black?" I mean, actually quite a reasonable question. But someone heard him say that because he hadn't disconnected. They complained, and he was fired. He was investigated and then fired for gross misconduct. And with our help,
in a private conversation with his wife.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So we helped him bring a case for unfair dismissal in the employment tribunal, and he won that case. And he's just received a 5-figure compensation package from West Midlands Trains as a consequence. So that's just one example. But there are
so much about the bottom line.
Yeah, yeah.
All right. So it's a common theme now. Anything you say online may come to haunt you at your workplace. You've mentioned universities. Maybe we can delve into that into greater detail, because here in Hungary it's difficult to understand how you can lose your job essentially for something perfectly reasonable that you happen to say online, or maybe not even online. Maybe even a classroom, and maybe a student sues you or tells on you. So the background to all this is the emergence of big tech companies, of social media, and of content moderation, I would suppose. What's your view on that, and do you have any ideas of how to solve this?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the reasons censorship has increased, in Britain anyway, and probably in America too, over the past 10 to 15 years, is because social media platforms have become the digital public square. And they, not all of them, but most of them, and certainly the bigger ones, have these quite censorious content moderation policies, whereby if you say something that breaches a taboo, if you trespass on sacred values of some kind, as defined by, for the most part, the woke, then you can lose your account, your content will be removed, suppressed, and so forth. I think the areas in which it's become difficult to speak freely. First of all, anything challenging the wisdom of the lockdown policy was verboten. Then when the vaccines began to be rolled out, anyone questioning the safety or efficacy of the mRNA COVID vaccines, that was taboo. And there's plenty of evidence about the efforts that were made to suppress anyone doing any serious research or discussing that research about the safety and efficacy of the mRNA vaccines, whether within the kind of cathedral of science and the various funding bodies, whether it was the Department of Homeland Security or various health agencies like the WHO encouraging YouTube to remove content that challenged any aspect of the vaccine rollout. So that became very difficult. Anyone questioning the... Hi, John. Good to see you. I think anyone questioning the idea that we are in the throes of a climate emergency, and that the only solution is to reduce our carbon emissions as quickly as we possibly can, but certainly at the very latest by 2050. If you challenge any aspect of that agenda, you can find yourself in trouble, being censored, having your account removed by Facebook, YouTube. And I think that there became this kind of racial justice agenda that has been percolating away for some time, but really blew up after the death of George Floyd in, May 2020. And since that blew up, it's become taboo, I think, to challenge any of the various aspects of that particular agenda too. And there are some other orthodoxies that you're simply not allowed to challenge, not on any big mainstream platform like YouTube, Facebook. Twitter may be changing now that Elon Musk has bought it, but it remains to be seen. One other thing is the trans rights activists agenda. So more or less every mainstream media platform and every big tech social media company has sided with the trans rights activists against the gender-critical feminists. So in the ongoing public debate, which is unfolding across the Western world about where you draw the line between trans rights and women's sex-based rights, almost the entire media establishment, whether digital or legacy, has sided with the trans rights activists. So to challenge their agenda has also become taboo, particularly in universities. So, I mean, one example, a member of the Free Speech Union's Advisory Council, a journalist called Helen Joyce, who has a PhD in mathematics from UCL, she was invited to speak at Gomberland Keyes College, Cambridge, a few weeks ago. And fuss was made by various LGBTQ+ activists, saying that this woman should not be given a platform at such a distinguished college at Cambridge University because her views were transphobic and hateful. Very disappointingly, the master of the college, Professor Pippa Rogerson, and the senior tutor sent an email on the internal email server to all the students at Keyes saying that they agreed that Helen Joyce's views were hateful and offensive, and they themselves wouldn't be going along to this talk, which was completely contrary to the college's own free speech statement, as well as the university's free speech policy. But those policies are more honored in the breach than the observance. As a result, I think in part of this kind of tacit condemnation by the college authorities, the event itself was very noisily protested, and at times you couldn't hear what Helen Joyce was saying. It was drowned out. And actually, she's a former Britain editor of The Economist. She's written a best-selling book called Trans. She's very thoughtful and intelligent and highly educated, and is an old-fashioned feminist. And to describe her views as hateful and beyond the pale is, I'm afraid, typical of the way in which trans rights activists and LGBTQ activists in the UK have prosecuted this particular debate.
All right, thank you, Toby, and please welcome John O'Sullivan. I'm glad you've made it, John. I don't really need to introduce him, but still, we all know John as someone who was an advisor and speechwriter for Maggie Thatcher, an editor and journalist for decades, both in the US and in the UK, and always someone whose wisdom we are happy to draw on in all public matters. So, how hateful has your speech been at times, John? Have you been attacked for hate speech?
Well, I think I'm a rather cautious person as a journalist. I mean, I was a sketch writer, and that meant that I was being critical, but critical from a fundamentally mocking and humorous standpoint rather than the savage one. Occasionally, of course, the occasion called for a very savage criticism, but there was never a sense, I think, and indeed England, never a sense that political questions were things that you were not allowed to express a free opinion on. I mean, in my lifetime, and I'll be brief here because obviously I haven't heard everything you've said.
We're bringing you up to speed in just a minute.
Yeah, okay. And I want to apologize to everyone for being late. I'm afraid in some way I was kidnapped by a taxi driver who was, my cell phone was out of juice, so I found myself in one of these postmodern minor nightmares, but that's not your concern, and I'm sorry about that. I would say simply that one of the things which I think I have noticed, and I'd be interested in Toby's view on this, which is that when I was growing up, censorship was something that primarily seemed to concern moral and sexual questions. And there was some censorship, theatrical censorship, but in general, the newspapers, books, magazines were free of it. And it was films and the cinema and the theatre which attracted someone like Mrs. Whitehouse, which is to say, old-fashioned moral conservatives who wanted to protect people from obscenity and so on. Now, that has more or less completely vanished. In fact, when I was growing up, the office of the Lord Chamberlain, who actually was officially a theatrical censor, was eventually abolished after a review called The Lord Chamberlain Regrets, mocking the whole office. Now, there then was a period in which we seemed to be living in a pretty free world. But then the second kind of wave of censors arrived. And these censors came from, fundamentally, I think, from the progressive left. And they concerned political questions, racial questions, and some scientific questions. And we saw that particularly following the issuing of the fatwa against Salman Rushdie. And Salman Rushdie was from the Ayatollah Khomeini. And this was an extraordinary event. I happened to be on a panel talking about press freedom at the Columbia Journalism School when somebody came in and announced that it had just happened. And all of us on the panel condemned it. Most of us did so in a kind of nervous, we don't really know what this is about way. But I was also on the panel with Christopher Hitchens, and he was right away clear that this was a major event and the beginning of a serious attempt to protect Islam from any criticism to the point where fanatical Islamists would be prepared to murder people. And of course, that has continued to the present, because only very recently Salman Rushdie was again attacked, and I think we have to say he has been living under tight security. I think he may have come out a bit more recently. Came out, been living for most of the life since that 33 years ago, and now he's going to have to face doing so for the rest of his life. I think that the desire to protect minority groups, and particularly we're talking here about, and the religion of Islam is understandable. It's nobody wants to expose people, fundamentally decent people, to attack and to humiliation and so on. But the fact is, to try to satisfy the demands of people who actually want to introduce a new law of blasphemy in our own societies, particularly when the blasphemy is unrelated to the traditional society of Western countries, is an absurd one. And we have to find a way of persuading governments to be a somewhat stronger, and not just governments, because the fact was that although people, the literary world in particular, the political world too, rallied to Salman Rushdie 33 years ago, within a very short time, all kinds of excuses were being made why we would have to accept some restraint on our expressions of criticism if they involved Islam. Now, that was the second wave of censorship. My impression is, and I think you may have just been making this point, that there's now a third wave, and it comes from government directly in protecting, I would say, in protecting its erroneous policies, particularly in relation to lockdown. I mean, you played a part in exposing the lockdown arguments to serious and effective and sustained criticism. And you've done so both as a free speech campaigner, but also as somebody who actually thought that the policy, it was a policy-based argument too. And I think that's been very important. And the fact is, you have been vindicated completely. But what is, from the standpoint of this discussion, important is the degree to which newspapers, media organizations, the new social media organizations have become active agents of political censorship and scientific censorship. I never thought something like that could really happen in a society in which has been, for most of my lifetime, fundamentally based on free social criticism in almost every area of life. And that is the biggest change. And the fact now that you have organizations which are attempting to prevent free debate on the one hand, but also scientific criticism by people who are well-credentialed experts, in some cases a very large number of them. On climate change, that's true also, but it's particularly true, of course, in relation to COVID. So when that happens, you really find yourself in a wilderness of, a hall of mirrors, and a kind of wilderness, because normally you would look for vindication, or you would look for criticism. You hear a point of view expressed which seems to be challenging, odd, reasonable, sometimes mad. And when you turn to people whom you would normally think would be reliable guides to why it might be mistaken, or indeed why it might be entirely justified, you don't find them. You don't find them easy to find, and you very often find that they are under some kind of vow of silence. The professional organizations for which they work will expel them. They will lose their medical license. They will be subject, as for example Helen Joyce was, they've been subject to really insulting and vicious remarks. I'll just end on this point. It's very ironic that one of the most frequent accusations from the would-be censors here is that what the lone critic is saying is hateful. It's almost never hateful. I'm not denying there could be one or two cases. It's almost always polite, cautious criticism which is rooted in an honest attempt to look at the evidence. But the response from the people who say it's hateful is itself enormously hateful. And that is something which should, in a sense, tip us all off, that something highly paradoxical and vicious is going on, and that we should turn away from it. I think the mass of people are turning away from it. That's the explanation of the rebellion of parents in the United States. But what is, and that's something if I were going to be critical of that, I would say, frankly, it hasn't been large enough. and it hasn't been as politically critical as I would hope. But the fact is, it has happened. What's really alarming is I think the comparison is obviously with that late 50s science movies, the invasion of the body snatchers. And because you very often feel you're talking to people who have lost all normal powers of hearing and responding, but are in fact automatons chanting some kind of indoctrinated orthodoxy. So, thank you.
The end is nigh. We live in a wasteland full of zombies. Toby, would you like to react to this short cultural history of censorship in the modern age?
I thought very, very fantastic tour de horizon. I puzzled over why the mainstream media and the big social media platforms seemed so willing to suppress any challenge to the response to the pandemic across the world. It was as though every country had become like China, and it had become taboo to challenge the wisdom of the authorities' response. And why was that? You know, how did that come to pass? I think there are probably three reasons why the British media went along with, didn't really challenge the official government response to the pandemic, the lockdown policy in the first instance. I think partly because they just wanted to avoid regulation, too much state interference. So they were, I think, were legitimately concerned. So Ofcom, for instance, the regulator of state broadcasting, introduced these coronavirus guidelines at the same time as the first lockdown was rolled out, whereby if holders of Ofcom licenses like the BBC, like ITV, Sky, LBC, if they featured people on their programs who were too critical of the lockdown policy, if they undermined public confidence in the wisdom of the lockdown policy and discourage people to observe the increasingly draconian restrictions on their liberty, then they could be fined by Ofcom. So I think there was this kind of desire to avoid being censured, being fined by regulators. It was also, I think, they had a financial interest in towing the official line. So newspapers are find it increasingly difficult to sell advertising. And they frequently, in order to sell advertising, have to reduce the rate on the rate card. So, you know, if Volkswagen wants to take out a page in the Sunday Telegraph, it'll pay maybe 20% of rate card instead of the full 100%. Whereas the government, when it was promoting the lockdown policy, spent hundreds of millions on newspaper advertising, radio advertising, and they paid rate card. So the government would pay 100% of the rate card price to buy a full page in the Telegraph to promote compliance with the lockdown policy. So it was quite attractive from the newspaper's point of view to get this advertising, but in order to get it, they couldn't rock the boat too much. And then, you know, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation give a lot of money to The Guardian and The Telegraph and to the BBC, and they obviously were very much in favour of the lockdown policy and associated restrictions, so they didn't want to endanger those tens, in some cases hundreds of millions of pounds they were getting from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So there was a financial incentive too. And to a certain extent, the mainstream media has been bought and paid for by the authorities. But I think the biggest reason was just kind of groupthink. I think that supporting the lockdown, supporting the associated restrictions like masking, became a way of signalling that you were a member of the professional elite. You were a high-status person. You were responsible. You weren't going to challenge the science as though there was just this consensus, homogenous view amongst public health scientists that this was the right response, the best way to manage the pandemic. And they didn't want to be associated with people like Donald Trump or people beyond, conspiracy theorists, the kind of lumpen proletariat in the alternative media, people like Alex Jones. There was this kind of visceral horror of it being in any way associated with them. Much better to be on the kind of respectable side of that divide. So a lot of it was sort of status signaling, advertising their membership of the professional elite, and that obviously involves displaying your conscience and being morally concerned about the right things. And I think there has, I think, sprung up amongst professional elites, not just in Britain but across the Western world, this notion that democracy itself is endangered by too much free speech, that platforms like Twitter and Facebook pose a real challenge to democracy. If they become fertile ground for the growth of conspiracy theories and misinformation, that's going to have a catastrophic effect on the health and vitality of democracy. And, in their minds, the reason the American public voted for Trump and the reason the British public voted for Brexit wasn't because they had thought about the issues and thought that those particular policies, those candidates, aligned more closely with their traditional values. No, it was because they'd been manipulated by people spreading conspiracy theories and misinformation. It's because they were ill-informed. This notion that if you are properly informed, if you are an educated, properly informed person, then of course you wouldn't vote for Trump. Of course you wouldn't vote for Remain. It was only misinformed troglodytes being led up the garden path by these evil actors. That's the only possible explanation in their heads. And it's very much against the doctrine which used to be the kind of prevailing wisdom, which was the counter-speech doctrine, which was articulated by Louis Brandeis, a Supreme Court justice, I think in the 1920s, in which he said the best remedy for bad speech is not less speech, but more speech. It was a kind of, let's not suppress conspiracy theories, misinformation, arguments you disapprove of. Let's just have counter-arguments on the other side. And in the end, the wisest policy will win out. That was the prevailing wisdom amongst liberal elites for decades. But in the past decade or so, that's been abandoned, and people no longer think that is sufficient. They think that the free-for-all, the Wild West that is social media in particular, poses a real challenge, a real danger to democracy, and that's their pretext for rolling out various censorship programs and suppressing anyone who challenges their sacred values.
So can it be that these liberal elites have in fact reached the top of the pecking order, and any criticism may endanger that, which is why democracy now has to be protected from voters, essentially?
Well, I do think that's a very large part of the explanation. I think that actually my father wrote a book called The Rise of the Meritocracy, and when I was in Budapest three years ago as a guest of the Danube Institute, I was talking about my father's book, and he was not a fan of meritocracy. He didn't like the idea that we would be governed by these cognitive elites, partly because he was a socialist and he thought it would be a way of sustaining inequality and forestalling the emergence of the kind of socialist Shangri-La. But anyway, he came up with some pretty good arguments, and he predicted in this satirical book he wrote, a bit like 1984, it looked into the future, and he predicted mass populist revolts against the cognitive elites who'd started to govern in very much their own interests as a kind of self-perpetuating oligarchy. He predicted mass populist revolts round about 2033. And in the populist revolts that we saw with the election of Trump in 2016, maybe again in 2024, and Brexit in the UK, it seemed to be almost the coming to fruition of my father's prophecies. I think people became disillusioned with these technocratic, cognitive elites because of the mistakes they made. The mistakes they made during the global credit crunch, the mistakes they made in the war on terror, the war in Iraq. They'd become discredited. They'd lost a lot of their legitimacy. Their legitimacy depends upon them being wiser and more intelligent and better informed. They are the experts. We should be guided by the experts. They're Plato's philosopher kings. Their authority rests on the wisdom of their decisions. And when they appeared to get several things wrong, people thought, well, hang on a minute, maybe we shouldn't be governed by these so-called experts. Maybe there's a better alternative. So I think when the pandemic came along, they thought, aha, here's an opportunity to restore our authority, our legitimacy. Here is a threat, an existential threat to the future of mankind. We are going to save mankind. First of all, we're going to come up with the correct response, which is to lock everyone in their homes on pain of being fined. And then we're going to come up with these vaccines, which are going to make it safe for everyone to come out of their homes again. It became quite clear, I think, quite quickly, that both of those policy responses to the pandemic weren't particularly sensible, had a lot of shortcomings. First of all, the lockdowns probably weren't necessary on the kind of scale they were rolled out. And secondly, the vaccines don't appear to work very well. They don't appear to prevent infection, for instance. So the vaccine mandates didn't seem to have any rational basis. So I think they sort of now fear that having made this kind of colossal policy error, having plunged the world into another global recession, we're going to have runaway inflation in the UK, we're probably in a recession which is going to last longer than any recession since the Second World War. Liz Truss was hounded from office because now we're in hock to the bond markets to such an extent we don't have much room for political maneuver. And everyone, I think, is beginning to wake up to the fact that this was a disastrous policy response, which has immiserated the population, and we'll be paying the price for decades. And I think they're terrified that there'll be another reckoning, that something like what happened in 2016 will happen again, but it'll be 10 times worse. So they're trying to do whatever they can, suppress any criticism, use any means necessary to fend off any serious criticism of their management of the pandemic and their management now of the kind of global financial crisis, for fear that their days are coming to an end. And this revolt my father predicted is in the not too distant future.
Just on this point, I think there's a kind of progression in how people regarded lockdown and the vaccine. Because at first, when we get the pictures from what's happening in Italy, the health service there being overwhelmed, a lot of coffins being brought in, so many people are dying. It was the elites as well as everyone else who panicked at that point. I mean, the British government had been saying until that point, look, we have a well-established, well-thought-out plan for dealing with epidemics and pandemics. It's been given a gold star by the World Health Organization. And the deputy the deputy chief medical officer appeared on television and was very calm and reasonable and said, yes, these things are very distressing, but the best thing to do is for us to safeguard the elderly who are most vulnerable, although, by the way, the fact is that even if you were my age, the chance of your dying if you got COVID was still only about 2%. So the vulnerable were not as vulnerable as all that. Now, but there was a disposition on the part of the public when the elites panicked and decided that they would have to go in for a full lockdown, which is the first point, before the vaccines are in view. Most people, I think, thought, well, that's what happens in pandemics and epidemics. That's why we've always dealt with them. And people stay in their homes, they stay from work and so on. This is how you stop smallpox spreading and the rest of it. So I think there was a general social consent for a while. And then people began to say, And this was not, some of these were experts and some of these were elites. I mean, in a way, Toby, you were an example of thoughtful members of the elite looking at the evidence for how the policies were working and concluding, well, we don't really go along with that. We think we can see errors and flaws. Now, the public at this point is thoroughly bought in to the lockdown and waiting for the vaccine message. But when you and people like you begin to raise questions, then they are kept in line, not only by the elites, but also by the more rowdy and Mr. and Mrs. what was the Jack Morons of the press, who begin to say, if you're a skeptic about the lockdown, if you're a skeptic about how the vaccine is going to work, if you resist being vaccinated because the government has given the pharmaceutical companies an immunity for civil action if the vaccine goes wrong, which, by the way, at that point I was inclined to think, well, if it's this big an emergency, maybe it's justified in doing that. But I have to say, I didn't like it. I didn't like the idea that millions of people were having a medical treatment that was untested and could have all kinds of consequences, which it has since done. But it was the populists were employed on the side of keeping the panic going. So it was completely hypocritical, so to speak, of the elites to portray this as a civilized, intelligent experts on the one hand, and noisy, illogical, angry and bitter populists on the other. There was a good deal, in fact, we now know, the British government and other governments actually had discussions and developed policies for increasing fear. And they did so, as they saw it, for good reason. The more fearful the population was, the more they would take precautions, the more there would be the more they would resist foolish ideas, and the more quickly the pandemic would end. But the fact was that in any sensible policy making, one of the things you do is you say, we're all here to decide this question. I want to make sure, you might say, Boris, I want you to knock down the arguments that are being put for this. I want you, whatever you privately think, give me the best possible case against this. We never heard that from this policy making. We never heard the reasonable anxieties and criticisms that some people obviously must have had. And the argument, by the way, we must defer to the experts, is everybody, what tells you that everybody knows that's a fundamentally false argument is, if you are diagnosed with terminal cancer, the first thing you will say is, may I have a second opinion? And the experts differ. There are almost no cases where they don't. And consequently, we have to arrange policy-making arguments that institutionally guarantee the internal criticism of the committees and governments everywhere. And that obviously didn't happen. So the populism was employed by the elites and by governments in order to keep the populace in line at the very same time as they're accusing the critics of being populists in disguise.
Can I ask John a question, Boris?
Right.
Thank you.
So let's keep it short.
Okay. One of the reasons I think that there was no red team challenging the scientific advice being given to the government by SAGE is because there wasn't anyone in the inner cabinet who had a degree in science. So they were easily bamboozled by this notion that there was just one scientifically correct approach to managing the pandemic. When you worked
with Margaret Thatcher, because she had a degree in chemistry, did that mean that she was more likely to interrogate the scientific advice she was being given?
Well, she loved doing that. And on one occasion, there was a new scientific advisor appointed. I get this story from one of my colleagues. And she was meeting him for the first time. And so when he starts to express certain views, she begins to interrogate him. She puts him through a cross-examination of someone who had both a scientific education and training as a tax lawyer. So she was formidable on those occasions. Well, as the poor man's body is being carried out of the room, she turned to probably Charles and said, why do people take everything I say so seriously? But the fact was that they were nervous and so on. That was the reason. But yes, she was very good at doing that. And it was second nature to her. And she herself, look, why did I get on with Margaret Thatcher? By accident, because I was a guest with other, in 1973, I was a guest she was a guest at a lunch of parliamentary journalists. And I was the only Tory in the room apart from her. She was Minister for Education. And she gave a little talk. And I had just come back from looking at the voucher education system in Alum Rock, California. I'd spent about a week there. So I was stuffed to the gills with facts, figures about educational vouchers. And so I asked her about them, and she dismissed the idea. She was in a government led by Ted Heath. And she dismissed it, and I then attacked. She responded. We went back and forth like this, and eventually she had to leave. And as she left the room, all of the other journalists there fell about laughing. And Simon Hoggett said, "You're the only person here who has any time for her, and you're the person who had the huge row." But what he didn't know, is Mrs. T liked people who argued with her. And I think John Major did realize that, and that's why he argued with her.
Right.
All right, if we want to allow a little bit, a few minutes for questions, and also take into account that we began late and will not be able to do our full 90 minutes here, let's just take the conversation back to free speech, which is the subject of the evening, in a more general way, and it begins with free thought. Now, here in Hungary, we lived under communism, and we did not have free speech at all. But paradoxically, my impression was at the time that many or most Hungarians kept their thoughts free, maybe because of this, in the little private spaces that they managed to salvage. Whereas in the West, where free thought was the tenet of everything, the base of society, how society was organized, some sort of collectivist thinking emerged. How could that be? What can be the reason for this contrast?
Yeah, I was even in the I think in the early 1980s, I set up a magazine, this was before the Modern Review, called The Danube. And it was partly inspired by this idea that there were many more free thinkers in the Eastern Bloc and in the Soviet Union than there were in the West. And by having this monolithic authority telling you what you could and couldn't say, actually stimulated a kind of a degree of intellectual rebellion, which meant that ideas, Western values, the canon of Western literature and philosophy was all taken much more seriously in places like Hungary and Czechoslovakia than it was in Britain and America. And how could we... and also, I remember reading Milan Kundera, and Milan Kundera, I think, in maybe The Unbearable Lightness of Being, says that among the dissidents in Prague in the 1970s and early 1980s, there was this concern that, we're all fighting for freedom.
we would like our country to become a liberal democracy. But there is a risk that once we achieve that, we'll lose our sense of purpose and we'll value what we now value so highly less. It's only because we don't have it that we value these things as highly as they should be valued. So that was a real concern. And I sometimes think that, I'm engaged in a kind of coalition in Britain of people who are anti-woke, fighting for free speech. And we sometimes worry, I think, that, we put all our differences aside. I mean, I now often find myself in rooms on the same side of people who supported Jeremy Corbyn in the, last Labour leadership election. I'm on the same side of people like Helen Joyce, radical feminists who, 15 years ago would have hated me. And there is this kind of, we're odd bedfellows, a coalition of old-fashioned leftist, classical liberals, traditional conservatives, all united against this kind of new authoritarian movement, which is trying to rigidly police what we can and can't say in the public square. And I sometimes worry that when we win, we'll then just fracture into a million quarrelsome, warring tribes. It'll be back to how it was. And there's something quite nice about that sense of camaraderie that comes from putting our normal differences aside to together fight in a common cause.
Yes, I think that's the same thing happens in a much more exaggerated way, actually, when a country finds itself in a war. Everybody begins to pull together because obviously the cause that unites them is so overwhelmingly important. Now, why would this happen why would the same thing happen in Hungary and the other countries of the Warsaw Pact? Well, remember, there's a period between 45 and I'd say 48 in this country in which initially you do have democracy. In fact, democracy is probably doomed by the fact that the first election is an overwhelming victory for the smallholders party, which tells the communists that they're never going to be able to actually get power in the democratic system in this country. But as the net or the vice slowly tightens on people in this period, the 3 years or so, what anybody learns is that, my goodness, they really are not going to allow us to be free. For them, it's terribly important to suppress even the slightest expression of disagreement, of cultural diversity, as well as of political diversity. It's very important for everybody to say the same thing. Yes, not only to be quiet, but you have to actually tell the lie. And others, I'm sure, here know the famous essay by Havel, in which the greengrocer puts in the window, "The workers of the world unite," and that's just going along with the system. It means that he's not interrogated, he's not really lent on by authority. He's demonstrated his willingness to support the system. But the moment he removes it, then he has to show courage. He's already shown courage, and he has to demonstrate a willingness to defend his own right to think as well as to speak. And I think that people in this country and people in the other countries of the communist bloc of those days, they knew how important freedom was, partly because of the determination of their enemies to suppress it, and to suppress it in a thoroughgoing way. So that, I think, is my answer. I just wanted to say that I, as a sixth former, read your father's book, The Rise of the Meritocracy, and I thought it was an absolutely marvelous book. And it seems to me that, and I share, I mean, as a conservative, I was always somewhat more skeptical of meritocracy than other people for that reason. But as the last few years have happened, I've, in my mind, been checking the list of things that he forecast, and one of them was in the Brexit debate. The House of Lords suddenly begins to recover powers and resistance to democracy that we all thought had been abandoned forever. But obviously, the Lords had begun to think of themselves, when all is said and done, we're here because we're experts. And that was, in fact, the message of his book, too. So I want to thank you for your father's book, and to say, that book was a good example of free thought, because it was intelligent, critical analysis of the direction we were moving in, but which seemed benign, but which had aspects of it were rather dark.
All right, thank you for your thoughts, John and Toby. We don't have these 25 minutes that you see there, because we have to probably allow one question. Let me see what we have here on the Slido. What shall we pick? Where's the line between private entities enforcing their own policies and the right of expression for individuals? These are all very difficult questions. Shall we go with that one? Or shall I just ask you on your view on Elon Musk taking over Twitter? Is that salvation?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question for a challenge for conservatives who instinctively want to defend freedom of association and protect private companies from excessive regulation and state interference. What do you do when private companies which exercise such an outsized influence on public debates become completely captured by one side in those debates? So, instinctively, I want to defend Twitter and Facebook and YouTube to devise whatever content moderation policies they want. But if they all lean in the same direction, given what extraordinary monopolies they are, it then does begin to feel unhealthy for democracy. And I think I'm willing to surrender my commitment to freedom of association in the interests of defending free speech. And I think a good example is after my run-in with PayPal, when they closed 3 accounts, including the Free Speech Union and the Daily Skeptic, I kicked up a huge fuss, used whatever political influence I had, and eventually PayPal restored the 3 accounts. We're now trying to amend a bill currently going through Parliament called the Financial Services and Markets Bill. And the amendment would make it illegal for large payment processing companies like PayPal to withhold or withdraw service from customers for purely political reasons. And I think that if we can get that amendment passed to the bill, then that would go some way to forestalling the emergence of a Chinese-style social credit system in this country, except instead of the communist authorities enforcing ideological orthodoxy, it would be woke capitalist corporations based in Palo Alto. But I think I'm willing to fetter PayPal's freedom of association if PayPal is going to continually withdraw or withhold service from people because they don't like their politics. I think that's a bargain I'm willing to strike in order to preserve free speech and stop these companies exercising such an enormous influence on public debates currently unfolding in the UK and elsewhere.
John?
Well, I generally agree with that. I think the other element of the social media companies, and Twitter in particular, is they are not being honest with us. They are in fact imposing censorship, not simply the kind of censorship which says this is horribly offensive material, pornographic or otherwise, and we want to keep it out of the reach of children, etc. I mean, I can see that there is some kind of a real problem there which has to be tackled, if it can be, without damaging freedom in a more general way. No, what they are doing is, if I were to, for example, go into Twitter and say, well, actually, I Google all of them, and say I'm particularly interested in Toby Young's new free speech union, the likelihood is it'll be on page 5 of about 25 previous suggestions, all of which are why Toby Young's free speech union is a bad thing. So there is a deliberate attempt to censor and to mislead and to misdirect, and I don't see that can be, there's any kind of, on any public virtue argument that can be defended. And of course, the fact is, if they are claiming, as they claim and indeed get, the privileges of a common carrier, then they are under an obligation to accept everyone on equal terms. And that's a principle which goes back to She Stoops to Conquer by Oliver Goldsmith, in which the farce takes place in what these people think is a hotel, but is in fact a private home, and their outrageous behavior is the comedy. But we seem to have forgotten kind of very basic principles of living in a free society, partly because I think we were overawed by the extraordinary technical accomplishment that is represented by the internet.
And that, I think, closes the day. Let me have a look at our organizers. I see 20 minutes here, which means that it's now time to stop, right? Thank you very much for listening, and thank you, gentlemen, for your wise thoughts.